My name is Wendy Osborne. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar on behalf of IAVE. For those of you who have already been on one of these series of webinars, you're very welcome back. And for those of you who are new to us today, you also are very welcome. This is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars on youth volunteering and social change that were organised by IAVE this year. It has been a really interesting series and follows up on work that IAVE carried out on youth volunteering last year in 2022. And indeed, it remains a focus for IAVE in terms of its ongoing work, giving a priority to youth volunteering, to sharing experience and knowledge, and doing research where appropriate. And we have been fortunate with these 4 webinars that we have had context papers written by our presenter today, Dr. Chris Malora, to provide the context for the webinars, and that has added to people's understanding and knowledge. I'd like to take this few minutes just to thank all the panel members who have joined us for this series, and indeed also for today's 6 panel members. We've had a global range of individuals joining us, and they have shared their experience and knowledge and opinions about this really important topic of youth volunteering and social change. And for IAVE's point of view, as we head now, looking forward towards October 2024 and the 27th World Volunteer Conference to be held in Busan in South Korea. And the title of that is People Power, Creating Sustainable Future Through Volunteering. And for me, I think personally, you can't have that sustainable future and you can't have volunteering as an enabler, catalyst and deliverer of social change without thinking of the young people of today's generation and the young people who will follow in the next generations to come. So youth volunteering is a very, very important to sustaining volunteering going forward and sustaining that contribution to social change that is so vital to us all as we look to a more sustainable future for ourselves and indeed our planet. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this wrap-up webinar for the series, if you like, but not the end of the journey in relation to discussing youth volunteering. I think we will continue to do that, and as I said, IAVE will continue to focus on it. So I'm delighted again to welcome our presenter and moderator for this session, Dr. Chris Malora. Chris, originally from the Philippines, is a lecturer in education at the Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at Goldsmiths, University of London in the UK. He is currently doing leading on a 3-year research project, which is really interesting, Literacies of Dissent, exploring the literary and learning dimensions of youth social movements in the Global South. And that really, I think, links in with the whole theme of youth volunteering and social change. So we're delighted to welcome Chris again to join us for this 4th webinar. I'm not going to say it's the last time you will join us on a webinar, Chris, for I think that would be wrong. But I'd like to thank you personally for the time and effort that you have brought to this particular series this year. So now it's over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. And hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. These webinars have always been a very global sort of gathering of all of those interested and committed to youth volunteering. Okay, so I think what I'll do at this part of the session or of the webinar is really try to go through some of the brief reflections that I've had from the IAVE series on youth volunteering and social change. Next slide, please. So the webinar series has been hosted, of course, by IAVE. It's 4-part series focused on 2 aspects of youth volunteering. First, what are some of the key issues that are challenging young people today? So we've explored issues such as employability and sustainable livelihoods, to issues around health and well-being, up to the point of activism. Number 2, how do young people respond to these issues? And what can we learn from their responses and leadership? So it's really taking stock about some of the case studies and best practices of youth-led social action and solutions. And number 3, actually, there's 3 key points. What can youth-involving organizations do or do more to partner with young people in meaningful ways and further support youth-led solutions to these issues. So we're also looking at, the question of how and the question of action. What can we do to support young people's work? So accompanying these 4 webinars, there are 4 challenge papers that are available open access via the IAVE website. And we welcome you to, I think Gal will be able to share with you the links to those paper. And we welcome your feedback and comments to it. These are called challenge papers because they I think they present more questions than answers. So you'll find yourself with challenge questions that you can use to reflect on your own work with young people. The series was able to attract 322 participants, as you can see here in the slide, coming from 87 countries. And the audience was quite diverse. Usually we would have, corporates, academics, we have practitioners, development workers, youth leaders, and youth activists who all share the same passion and commitment to youth involvement and participation and development. If you go to the next slide, Gal, you will see all of the previous speakers. Next slide, please, Gal. You will be able to see all the previous, I think we lost the slides there. Okay, but we have had a wide variety as well of participants or speakers who were able to share our ideas around the topic of youth volunteering and social change. Okay, so what did we talk about? So we've already discussed what the main questions are, but what are some of the themes or the questions that we've explored in the webinar series? So the first webinar of the series was on the topic of youth volunteering, employability, and sustainable livelihoods, which again is a very important issue. That webinar explored the issue of youth employment or lack of employment, and whether and how volunteering can become a pathway for youth employability. We were joined by a global panel, and of course, the answer between the links between volunteering and youth employment was not straightforward. The global panel have really unpacked the links between volunteering and employability. While there were many experiences when volunteering could improve a volunteer's skills, knowledge, and networks to become more competitive in the global job market, there remain some challenges of exclusion and inequalities, wherein not all young people are able to access volunteering opportunities. There were also issues from this webinar around, okay, what are some of the challenges around skills matching or the lack of recognition and certification of skills gained through volunteering, and how these gaps need to be addressed to truly harness volunteering's contribution to employability. Now, the second session. Our slides are back. Okay, just before I go to the second session, I'd like to show this slide that really contains all of the speakers of our previous webinar. So from session 1 to session 3, these are all the individuals that have supported the series and have shared their experiences. These are all really large panels. In fact, we had a youth-led, an all-youth panel for session 3 where we talked about youth activism and youth volunteering. So our thanks goes to all these panelists for their time and for sharing their expertise with us. So next slide, please. So I've just talked to you about the first webinar. Now, the second webinar was around youth volunteering and well-being. Now, in this session, we expanded then our conversation beyond mental health and explored how volunteering could contribute towards enhanced well-being among young people. In this webinar, one of the things that we really found was that mental health and well-being are both cross-cutting issues. So they impact and they are impacted by a multitude of young people's concerns. So for example, mental health could impact employability as well as lack of employment could impact one's well-being. But we also discussed how well-being support and services are severely underfunded and inaccessible, and that's across different contexts from where the speakers were coming from, and how important, and despite of these challenges, it is actually young people who are taking matters into their own hands and providing services, mental health and well-being services in their communities. Now, the third webinar was on volunteering and activism. And as I've said earlier, we had an all-youth panel reflecting on how volunteering as an opportunity for young people to claim and position themselves as important actors and influential leaders in their communities. So in this session, young people were the youth activists that were part of the panel. They were really demanding that they be taken seriously, that their work needs to be respected and recognized, that they are given the space to share their voice, and that they need to be part of interventions on issues that concern them. So those are the first three webinars. And today is the fourth and the closing webinar of the series, right? So the aim for today is, together with a panel which I'm going to introduce to you later, we're going to reflect on some of the ideas and insights that have emerged from the discussions across these three webinars of the series. What role can young people play in shaping social change? And how can volunteering become a pathway for young people to become development actors in the many contexts where we work? Okay, next slide, please. So before we move on to the panel discussion and me introducing our panelists, what I'd like to do now is to underline four important aspects that really sort of emerged from the conversations during the webinar series. So I would like to say that this is not in any way a summary of everything that has been said, because that's quite impossible to do. But really what I wanted to do is to pick up or to pick some of the more important points that would be a good basis for our discussion this afternoon. So to do that, I've pulled together some quotes that are more or less representative of some of the key ideas. And these are quotes coming from the speakers themselves, right? So the first theme that have come out is the importance of meaningful and emphasis on the meaningful youth engagement, and what it means to engage young people in non-tokenistic ways. This is a quote from Mary Mlambo, who's a founder of Longelo Youth Development Initiative in South Africa. And Mary said in one of our sessions that we have a lot of initiatives that are youth-led, that are not youth-led, sorry, and we feed the young people with what we think they want. So many times you find that the youth are not interested in a youth club, for example, or to volunteer because they realize that's not for me, but for you. That's why we need to involve the youth in our initiatives, making youth volunteering youth-led. And Mary is really coming from a point of view of a practitioner and someone who's involving young people in their work. So the quote of Mary here strongly highlights the tendency of some youth-involving organizations to involve young people only in the implementation phases of some of the initiatives. So in other words, the organization already has a vision of development. Hello, can you still hear me? So I think what Mary was trying to say here, that it's important that young people are not only involved at the implementation stage of the project, but really for us to think about how can we involve young people in trying to shape a vision of development themselves. So, they have to be part of designing the process. And the lessons is that we need to meet young people halfway and to engage them in meaningful ways. George Fielding from policy and public affairs officer from Volunteering Matters UK says it really powerfully that young people don't want to engage with a tone and structure that they've had enough of. So we've got to demonstrate that the structures in our systems are willing to engage and meet them where they are. So what George is trying to say here is it's really pushing back against some of these tokenistic ways and maybe even bureaucratic ways of engaging young people, that our systems and the way we engage them, young people, need to be flexible enough, to engage them in ways that they want and that they prefer. Next slide, please. And part of that issue, I think, is the importance of recognizing youth leadership. So this is a quote from Olivia Clark, who's a project coordinator of Young Manchester in the UK. And she says, and I like the term here, she talks about the parachute, the tendency to parachute. Big organizations choose to parachute into the spaces that we're in. They listen but won't act on what we're saying, and they'll parachute into the spaces that young people are delivering great work and where young people are thriving, and then disappear. They'll get their picture, they'll get their quote, they'll get their thing ready for social media, and then disappear out of that space. So I think the most important thing is to be able and open to building on that leadership. What I feel Olivia is trying to emphasize here, and again, this is representative of some of the other insights that we've gathered through the series, is that, many young people are emphasizing the importance of a commitment towards building youth leadership or building on youth leadership, and perhaps a commitment towards working with them more closely and more intentionally. Many of the young people say that young people are leaders of today and not leaders of tomorrow, and this type of leadership must be harnessed with dignity and respect, and not do that parachuting thing that Olivia has been describing. This links with the earlier points around tokenistic ways of engagement and how young people are pushing back against that. What I think is also important here is Olivia is trying to warn us about a tendency to co-opt youth-led spaces and using these spaces in a way that puts forward an agenda that the young people might not be in line with, or that young people might not want. So when we talk about social change, I think this is the point of Olivia here and some of our other speakers in the series, that when we talk about social change, we need to ask who gets to define what this change could look like, and of course, for whom. Next slide, please. The third issue that that really came up really strongly was around youth volunteering, power, and inclusion. So as youth volunteers, according to Zyril de Los Angeles, who is a founder of Ugyon Youth in the Philippines, as young volunteers, we should not be afraid to say that volunteering is political. Because by saying this, it also means that we're volunteering because we want to take the side of the most marginalized people. And according to Maria Lucia Ataje, who's a youth volunteer in Peru, we need to challenge existing power structures. Activism and volunteering are both ways in which we can forge ourselves as leaders based on values that we connect to our own society. Youth-led solutions can reject any labels, and we need to create our own, and young people are able to create our own alternative spaces to make our concerns known. Now, Zyril and Maria Lucia's quotes here really highlights how volunteering is change-oriented, that it is not only repeating the status quo or delivering services required by others. The very act of volunteerism, especially in places where the civil society is very narrow, could be ways by which young people challenge power hierarchies. Maria here talks about labels, and this is something that has come out really strongly in some of our conversations in this series, that there are so many labels attached to the youth cohort across different contexts, that young people are inexperienced, that's why they should not lead, or that young people are apathetic, they don't care, they only care about themselves and social media. But actually, for Maria and for Zyril and for many of other youth volunteers we've spoken with, volunteering could be a way to challenge these labels, to show that young people take matters into their own hands and become significant actors of development in their communities, and really shape the change that they want to see and make that happen. I would also like to note that we have heard experiences of youth volunteering that could be highly politicized. So it's not only about volunteering being political, but also that it is highly politicized in some spaces. We've heard about young people, youth volunteers facing criminalization, policing, surveillance, and all of these punitive responses from state and non-state actors because of the work that they're doing. And we've heard that in the news, and we've probably experienced that ourselves as well. Next slide, please. And then the final point that I'd like to emphasize was this notion of intergenerational solidarity and collaboration. According to Jessica Jones, who's part of the IAVE Global Youth Advisory Group, an evolution also needs to happen around the idea of, this is the way that we did it for so long, so this is the way we're going to keep doing it. And a reminder that young people may have suggestions that have been tried before, or they may have ideas that take time to initialize or maybe to initiate, but these are ideas that should be heard. It's a call to remember that we have different resources and to respond to the world, that we have different resources and different ways to respond to the world that now is changing at a faster rate than ever before. What I think Jessica is trying to emphasize here is that young people are not trying to say that we should eliminate adults and that they don't want to partner with adults. They do, but it has to be in a way that takes account in young people's innovations and creativity. Intergenerational collaborations, if and when they happen, need to take into account differences and similarities in experiences, but also the wider power relationships that occurs in a world that is still, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, in a world where that remains adult dominated. Jessica's quote here reflects the importance of looking to young people to innovate and disrupt, to offer new ways of thinking about solutions to old age problems, to age-old problems, old age problem, whatever, to old problems. Many young people have emphasized the importance of mentorship, intergenerational solidarity, working together across ages. But what they're also saying is that intergenerational solidarity should be aware of intergenerational inequalities and violences, that we need to recognize that there continues to be a world where young people's voices are stifled or dissent are being stifled. So it's important to work together, but we need to be aware of the differences in power between adults and young people. So final slide. I think the main, final slide, please, Cal. I think the main message, if there's one main message that I would like to say, is that youth volunteering towards social change is not straightforward, right? So it's not a straightforward process that youth volunteering always leads to social change or to positive social change. I think we need to have a broader question here around under which circumstances can youth volunteering lead to what kind of social change and for whom? Social change looks very differently for different people. And I think we need to be very aware of how young people, or to what extent can young people shape the social change that they want. So I'll end here. Again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. But I think we are on time, perfectly on time, to now meet our speakers. So I'd like the speakers to turn on their camera as I call them. We'll start with Yvette Taki. Yvette is the chair of the IAVE Global Youth Volunteer Advisory Committee and youth representative. She's currently working as a business performance specialist at DHL Global Forwarding. Hi, Yvette. There you go.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us. And then we have David Bonnet. David leads GenU's Global Volunteer Initiative, which helps countries create or scale volunteer engagement programs to help accelerate results across a range of issues for children and young people. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us. You can see David there. And then I'd like to call on, sorry, it's not in the order of the slides. Sorry, I realized that. But we have the next person we have is Dr. Mohsen Gul. So Mohsen is a senior project manager at the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Mohsen is very experienced in terms of youth volunteering and has done incredible research projects in this area. So we're really happy that Mohsen is here. Welcome, Mohsen. Hope you can see him. Yeah, perfect.
Yep, I'm here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mohsen. And then I'd like to call Nadia Pereira. Nadia is a qualified project manager in a variety of project management styles and qualified access consciousness practitioner working with Discovery in South Africa, and has led various initiatives through Discovery's CSI programs. Hi, Nadia. Welcome. And then we have Matthew Williams. Matthew is Volunteer Participation Officer for Volunteer Now, a national volunteer center based in Northern Ireland, and his job is focused on developing youth volunteering. Hello, Matthew. And finally, we have Abigail Martinez Renteria. Abigail is an adult educator dedicated to social justice and sustainable development and serves as a mentorship program at Action SDGs coordinator for My World Mexico. Hi, Abby. Great. So we have our panelists. If you have any questions to any of them, there will be time to do that later. So I think we can close the slides now, Gal, so that our pictures will be bigger on your screen. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll try to throw some questions to our panelists, really based on some of the emerging issues from the series. And I think I'll start with let me see. I'll start with Mohsen, actually. Let me just pull up my notes. Oops. Okay, Mohsen, right here? Yeah, Mohsen is here. So this is my question to you. So Mohsen, one of the key points, as I've shared earlier, and one of the key conversations that we've been having in this series is to challenge us, is challenging people to think beyond engagement and consider meaningful youth participation. And a lot of people have been pushing back against, as we've said, right, tokenistic ways of working. So based on your experience and research, how does meaningful youth participation look like, and what could be done so that becomes a reality?
Thank you, Chris. A lot of it was already answered by the fascinating insights that you brilliantly shared. So it's very difficult to top up on that. But maybe a few reflections from my end is moving beyond engagement. Think of it as a spectrum. So think of it as what would meaningful youth participation look like in different contexts. What may be meaningful for me may not be meaningful in another context where someone's life is in danger or the social change they want to bring is not public, or policy is not ready to incorporate that, right? So it has to have the genuineness and influence, and we need to help provide that platform to young people for them to lead across the spectrum. Sometimes it can be youth-led, sometimes it can be youth-focused, sometimes it could be youth mainstream. So it doesn't always have to be youth-led. And when we say youth-led, you rightly said it does not mean absence of adults. It's about intergenerational solidarity and collaboration. And only when we recognize young people as partners, not as a stakeholder that needs to be engaged just because it looks good as a tick exercise for our projects, only then we would move beyond tokenistic engagement per se and really mainstream participation. It's not just also about participation, it's also about empowerment. Empowering through engagement is one factor, but empowering through giving them the right training, the right safe space for them to engage, giving them the right platforms for them to come together and work and really celebrate their agency. So let's not assume young people have agency by default. We need to invest in their agency. And in doing so, often I've worked, and I currently work with UNDP as the senior policy advisor on future of work. So every day we are engaging a lot of young people, but often it is like, you would say you're doing it in a meaningful way, but because of resources, funding, and everything, from the supply side issues, you will not be really engaging them throughout the cycle of the project or something. So by default, you're only using their voices to one point of the decision making. It's about what you said as a whole cycle. How can we engage with young people? So that's the supply side thing. The other side of the demand side is, not all young people volunteer because they want to volunteer. It can be a trap. It can be because I'm stuck in a vicious cycle of not getting employment. So I'm trapped in that waithood to get jobs and all. So we need to break those silos. One, that, and on the demand side, last point is, let's acknowledge that young people need to be supported on this journey, again through the agency development, but a lot of them require hand holding and given that support and a safe space creation for them to be champions of the social change they want to bring. And finally, I think on the demand side, one point which I really resonate with is, this is a transitionary phase in the life of a person, which means as their life grows, their motivations may differ. So they may be interested to become a president of an organization they formed in their high school, but 2 years after they want to go to university and don't want to be engaged in that program or thing they created, which is okay. Adults don't need to use that as an excuse for not engaging with young people, because it's a journey and we need to support them on this transitionary journey, that they will create leaders to follow in their footsteps, even if they've moved on and transitioned away from being youth themselves and into adulthood. So I'll shush here, but hopefully this was a quick reflection on all the amazing insights that you already provided. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mohsen. And I think that's a really sort of a reality check as well, that, trying to say that, not all young people want to participate in the first place. So there are many different motivations to participate, and not all of them would want to participate at this stage in their lives. But I think one thing that we could go back later in our discussions is the importance of support, organizational support and resourcing. We say that youth participation is great, but do we have enough staffing, resourcing? Do we have enough skills within the organization to engage young people in meaningful ways? So thank you for bringing that up. And I think this relates to my question to Yvette on youth leadership. And insights from the series have challenged the notions of young people as leaders of tomorrow, that they are leaders of today, taking matters into their own hands to solve many social issues. So as a youth leader yourself, Yvette, I wondered what more can be done by organizations to recognize and build on this youth leadership, and how can young people shape the social change that they want? Big questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that you highlighted in your opening that young people are no longer the leaders of tomorrow. We're the leaders of today, right? So whatever we do matters moving forward. And it's also really important and sort of links to what I'm going to talk about when you say that we young people deserve a seat at the table. And if we have the seat at the table, what do we do? And also mentioning what Jessica said, Jessica from Canada, that we don't want to no longer hear what older people have to, say. I mean, they've got, the wisdom, so to say, and then the experience, but this is also about things that, significantly affects us as young people. But then going back to the topic of youth leadership, you probably define that, as having the active involvement and engagement of young people, taking on leadership roles, responsibilities, and initiatives within their own communities and society at large. But I think that recognizing and building youth leadership is also really, really important. And it's a crucial step in empowering young people in the sense that they can make positive impacts in their communities. And we are able to nurture, or we can be able to nurture youth leadership through creating advisory boards. And IAVE has done really well in doing that. We've got our own youth advisory board that I also happen to chair, but trying to find meaningful solutions to the problems that young people from all over the world face, and how we can solve them in our own small way, but also giving young people the chance to make decisions. So if you give young people a seat at the table, you also need to give them the opportunity to be able to take decisions, that really matters or makes an impact in their own communities. We can also, allocate funding, and this is not just like funding that, most organizations like the UN or other organizations would throw, but how do we also monitor and track to make sure that the impact or the desired effects that is supposed to have is being had? But I think one of the important things that we can do is also to focus on policy changes, right? Because I think it starts from there, having enough policies that enable young people to be able to effect or enable the change that they want to see in their own communities. And that goes beyond just global organizations, but it also goes to, regional organizations and national organizations, and potentially and eventually the grassroots organizations. And then we also need to promote innovation, right? Because this is the only way that we can be able to sort of grow and measure the kind of change or social impacts that we want to see in our communities. And I think that this means that we encourage them to have innovative approaches to solving social issues, not just, traditional methods. And that also brings me to education. So I think that we are able to shape the kind of social changes that we want to see. It does need a lot of support, but we also need the backing of so many other people to be able to do that effectively.
Great, thank you. And thanks for highlighting the importance of policy change, I think. And I guess maybe we can talk about what is the role of young people towards policy change as well, which I think is again, another important issue or contribution of youth work. Okay, and now move on to David. And really, David, we would want you to reflect a little bit on the fact that social change happens in or through movement building. So building on movements and movement building in itself is something that helps facilitate social change. So what key learnings perhaps could you share from Gen U's experience? Maybe tell us a little bit about Gen U as a program, and how you're building on young people's work, and what do you think, what kind of social change do you think this is facilitating?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris, and good to see everyone. So a little bit about the Global Volunteer Initiative. It's a initiative that was created by UNICEF about 5 years ago. I'm currently housed inside of a UNICEF initiative called Generation Unlimited, which is focused on connecting youth across the globe to skills, employment opportunities, and social impact opportunities. The reason why UNICEF created this volunteer initiative several years ago now was on the view that positive social change happens often, not exclusively, but often when young people in communities collectively organize and take collective action. And that as a UN agency, relying exclusively on governments and intergovernmental processes wasn't going to move the needle fast enough on many pressing issues of the day. So that's how we got our start. That if we want to accelerate social change, we need to tap into the power of volunteers in communities. Over time, one of the things that we realized is that the experience of volunteering itself can also be a very powerful experience for young people. It can help them build skills, whether they're in specific areas. So, you know, if volunteers are working in public health, for example, then they're acquiring knowledge about public health. But then also what we call transferable skills or life skills, like creative problem solving, communication, teamwork, adaptability, stress tolerance, these kinds of things. So that's a little bit about sort of who and we are and why we got started. Our approach is very much context driven. And so it means that the volunteers, that we support volunteer activation and issue areas of concern to them in their communities. We're also always operating in radically different contexts when you look at the civic space from one country to the next. And I mention that because you asked me about the role of movements. And so I think I don't have a simple answer. I think, you know, in some places, what we've done is we've played a supportive role in the background. So as a UN agency, you know, we're not in a position to foment a movement, but we are in a position to provide youth leaders, youth volunteers with all kinds of support and amplification. And we can help sometimes connect folks to each other. So I recall I was brought into Bangladesh.
Or did we lose David? Oh no, David, are you there? Oh, I think we lost him.
It seems that way. Hopefully you can jump back on.
Yeah, no problem. Hopefully you can join us and tell us about Bangladesh. I think he was just about to say to share that experience. Why don't we move on to Nadia first, and then we'll see if David could join us later. So Nadia, my question to you is around well-being and mental health. And both of these issues, as I've said earlier, were really sort of what we found is that it's really cross-cutting in a particular sort of issue that young people were really sort of concerned with. So they impact and they link with a lot of social challenges like lack of employment, activism, climate change, etc. So how do you think can we better take account of young people's well-being when designing our programs?
Okay, thanks so much for the question, Chris, and for this opportunity to be included in this panel. So mental health and well-being is actually a big part of like my focus, my drive within all of the initiatives that I take part in. And so the first thing we sort of tackle when we start any program is usually the mindset of the youth, because the youth that we focus on within South Africa and Johannesburg specifically, where we started, is in the informal settlements. So it's underprivileged areas. And what you find is that the youth is there is no confidence within the youth. Sorry. So yeah, we start with the mindset. As I said, there is no there's a lack of confidence, and so there is a sense of hopelessness because there isn't much opportunity, and we find that the youth are in a state of they sort of have this mentality of, why should I work hard in school? Why do I even to finish school? You know, there is nothing for me at the end. You know, what am I putting this in for? So we have to sort of go in and sort of help them change that mindset. It's also just a behavioral change we need to bring in as well. And so we find that if we were to take any of the youth right now as they are and sort of give them an opportunity within a corporate or in any space, because they have that lack of confidence, they don't really feel like they fit in well. They don't have the confidence to speak up, to make suggestions, ask questions, because they really feel like they don't belong. So that is sort of the narrative we're trying to change. And that is why my focus is also sort of trying to find different forms of alternative therapies, because they don't have the opportunities we do. So, you know, if we've got a problem, I can go see a therapist because that's available to me, but it's not available to them. So we've got to find other avenues that's going to help them tackle these problems, you know. And so that is also where the whole access consciousness practitioner part in me comes in. And this is where my team and I are trying to find all these different forms of therapies, as I said, alternative therapies that we can sort of bring to the youth to tackle this. Because at the end of the day, when we're dealing with a group, we start with the mindset, you know, from mental well-being, emotional, physical, all of that. We sort of just have to prepare them and gear them up, so that when they step into volunteerism, they are there mentally, physically, and they're sort of prepared to take on any and all challenges that sort of surround them in their surrounding areas, and from home, school, and all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really important to be aware of some of the challenges that young people are facing. But also, I think we also need to sort of balance that and think of the capacities as well, that often it's very easy for some organizations to just think about the deficiencies of young people, especially in the areas where you work, right? These are very real problems, but I'm sure, you know, growing up in the slums as well, I know that there are capacities and ways of dealing with grief or sadness or whatever issues in a way that is more natural, sort of in that space. So I think it's both sort of understanding their challenges, but also what are some of the local capacities to address them. And I think your work of trying to find alternative ways of sort of engaging with them is really, really interesting. Yeah. Thanks for that, Nadia. I see that David is here. David, you were just telling us about the importance of supporting movements.
Yes, and my apologies. I have no idea what happened, but there was I spontaneously disappeared and reappeared. And anyway, so I was saying, so our sense is that it's one powerful pathway through which change happens. So we recognize, and if you look at the history of social change, it's often driven by social movements, and young people are often at the vanguard of such movements. But I'll just focus sort of on our limited experience. So right now, for example, we're going bigger in the green space. A lot of focus right now on supporting young people, whether it is to take action in their communities to adapt to the reality of the climate crisis, or whether it is to help them clamor and exert greater pressure on governments and corporates to step up and do their part. And we think the two things are related insofar as, if we support young people to take action in their communities to survive the crisis, our efforts to then amplify it, make it visible, help, we think, with their advocacy efforts. So let me kind of make it concrete. In a place like Kazakhstan, we've supported young people, youth volunteers, running a campaign to ban the use of single-use plastics in schools in Kazakhstan. In a place like India, we're working with volunteers in a couple of water-stressed states as they focus on water conservation. And then the plan is to is that on the shoulders of their actions to preserve water sources and conserve water in their communities, we can then help them as they go to COP28 and make noise and say, look at what we're doing. We're doing this as a matter of survival, but you governments, you corporates, you have to step up now to decarbonize, right? So young people are adapting to the crisis. And we hope, again, by helping them do that, and then by making it visible, that supports their advocacy message. We're doing a similar thing in Mongolia. Mongolia suffers from terrible air pollution. And we've equipped young volunteers with devices so that they can measure air quality. And then on days of high toxicity, they alert community members to what they can do. So I can go on and on and on. I help the volunteers as flood patrollers in a place like Nigeria, run tree planting campaigns in Brazil. All of this, these are mass actions that do two things. One is they often provide a real immediate benefit or impact in the communities. But equally important, we think, is that the mass action is a classic tactic for a movement to gain traction and draw attention. So even a place like Mongolia with restricted civic space, as we make their actions public, as they monitor air quality, that complements to elite level policy advocacy efforts to get the government to do more in terms of remediating the dirty air problem in Mongolia. So I don't know if that, it's again, like so many areas, and to your presentation as well, it's not a clean formula that applies everywhere. But the hypothesis is definitely driven by the conviction that if we help youth volunteers in, say, the green space, that ultimately supports both local and perhaps even sort of global movement in the space. So, and I'm happy to get into it more over Q&A.
Thanks, David. And it seems to me that the starting point is always what young people are doing, if I understood it right. So it's just see what movement building they're already doing and then support that in ways that you can. So it's really sort of
exactly. It's all about engaging them where they are and around the problems that they've identified, right? Around the injustices that they've identified. So our role is very much a supporting role. We don't foment movements, we support.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, I'll move over now to Matthew. And Matthew would want you to share us your insights around this big term called inclusion. It's another important keyword that have emerged from the series, and I think what a lot of the presentations in the series have identified or emphasized is the importance of being aware of the diverse challenges faced by young people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different genders, race, etc., when engaging them with volunteer work. And we know that some people are not even readily able to volunteer because of some of these issues. So how do we ensure that our engagement with young people through volunteering is inclusive?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. And yes, certainly a massive issue, that word inclusion, and whenever I see my name put against it, really happy that I was getting that one. But I think in terms of, in a good position to talk about it, because particularly in a Northern Irish context, inclusion has been such a big issue in terms of volunteering and society for such a long time and a long period of time. And I'll get into that in a couple of seconds, but I just want to go back to just a few reflections, and as well as yours, Chris. You had said when you were reflecting on Jessica from IAVE's sort of statement or answer to a question about that we're in a world that is adult dominated, and whenever we look at inclusion, how do we get to a point where both adults and young people are at the same level and bringing their experiences at a level point to the field and really taking that forward? And I reflect on the last 2 days, of my work, I've been at a school summit here in Northern Ireland, and I've had two different groups of people coming to me together as volunteers. I've had the older generation, sort of that 50, 60 plus, but as well as that, young people there, that sort of 20, 25 down sort of age group there, helping to support that and watching them engaging with the young people who are attending that event, and you're seeing the benefit of having both generations there working together in terms of making that experience the best that it can be for the facilitators of the event, and as well as that, the students who are attending it, the young people able to get down in with all the social media stuff, getting pictures and everything like that, whereas the older people are able to impart that sort of wisdom and knowledge and bring that forward. So in terms of inclusivity in volunteering and having both generations working together towards the better good, a really, really good example of it. And it was great for me as a practitioner to see that in action. And as well as that, for the young people to be able to learn from it. And as you quite rightly said, Chris, in the question, and those social, economical sort of factors, in Northern Ireland again, big, we have, well, it's such a small country, a majority of it is quite rural. So how do young people get to those opportunities that are already available? Are the opportunities that are currently available accessible for the people who want to get involved in volunteering? And as well as that, do young people, coming through in society, are they aware of what volunteering is? I've been doing a lot of work with young people in schools in particular, and whenever I ask the question, do you know what it means to be a volunteer? Do you know what social change is? There's a lot of blank stares coming across the room where they're not really aware of what that means. And the education then has to improve around, volunteering, because society has suffered majorly from COVID-19, and the pandemic has had a big systemic impact in terms of volunteering. We've seen numbers have absolutely tanked in that. And how do we make, opportunities inclusive so that people can get involved, particularly now when we're in a global cost of living crisis as well? So many major issues that are making volunteering, not for young people in particular, but for, how are they going to get involved, and how do we make those opportunities inclusive? If we're talking about young people who come from deprived areas or maybe low income families, do they have access to technology to be able to access those remote opportunities? Well, the answer is probably not. So how do you provide them with the opportunities to get involved? Inclusion as a term and as practice, is what we're all striving towards as, investors in young people. But it's how do we go around doing that whenever there's so many barriers in place? I think of our work currently with asylum seekers and refugees, again, going back to what you've said, people who aren't necessarily choosing to be a volunteer, but they don't have another option. And again, that is something that we're seeing, because whenever they're coming to the UK with refugee status, they're not able to engage in employment. So then they have to volunteer to be able to get experience for whenever they do get those opportunities. So it's massively difficult to unpick inclusion and how to involve people in those opportunities. But I think by being able to identify the barriers that people are facing and start to pull them down or reduce them, making sure that opportunities are accessible for young people to get involved in, I think is a major strive that we all can make towards improving youth volunteering and starting to revive the sector as well. Because I say we've seen a massive drop in volunteer participation, and I know that in terms of a Northern Irish context. I'm not sure what it is in terms of global context, but I'd imagine it's fairly similar. So it's about how do we remove those barriers to start to increase those numbers again in terms of voluntary participation in various aspects of everything.
Yeah. And I think, it's a difficult task, I think, but what you're saying here is, in a way, our starting point needs to be an understanding that young people aren't a homogeneous cohort, that not all young people are experiencing volunteering or these issues in similar ways. A young person who lives in a rural area might have very different issues as someone who's living in an urban area, for instance, and there's all the intersection of gender, race, etc. I think it's just about being aware of those, and as you said, the barriers that is involved when you work with such a diverse group of young people. So, yeah, great. Thanks so much, Matthew. Now I move over to Abby. And I think, Abby, you and I have had conversations about, words like sustainable development or social change, and how, in some contexts, these are not really applicable because people would rather talk about social justice, for instance. Why social change? But it has to be social justice because of this colonial histories, etc. So I think what I'd really ask you to reflect on is that there's also this understanding that while young people's participation is often seen as positive, their activism and volunteering are not always celebrated. So as I've told you earlier, we've had experiences of young people facing punitive responses from, the legitimization of their work, the criminalization, etc. So based on your work and your research, what can we learn from young people in terms of challenging these injustices and violences? And how can we ensure that the social change is equitable and just? Over to
Thank
you.
you, Grace. Thank you. So, well, all of you were talking, and I was having a lot of thoughts in my mind. And one of them was this part that Matthew was saying, and about volunteering and what does it mean to be a volunteer. And I think that it's one of the things that I have found in my research, like these identities as volunteer and activist. What does it mean in a context, for example, as Latin America, that is where I work on, being an environmental activist is a pretty dangerous identity that you can have. Why? Because we are being murdered all the time. So you don't want to really be an activist because you are in danger and because you are facing these violences as well. So we have to be very aware about what does it mean for people to have these identities. I think that, well, I was working with activists and volunteers last year and their practices, and something that really struck me is, and that I really learned from them, is all these fluid identities that we have to adopt as volunteers and activists and people that are just very engaged with their community and want to have improved their community lives. We have to adopt different identities and languages as well. And one thing that I really like that Mosen was saying earlier is that sometimes we take for granted the agency of people. And for example, in my work, Mexico, we call volunteers and activists ambassadors. And we didn't realize that we were leaving behind a lot of people because they don't identify as ambassador. What is an ambassador? And what do we require to be an ambassador? So that's one of the things that it really struck me, because we have to think a lot about these terms and how are we labeling people and who are we leaving behind with those labels? Like, who is an ambassador, who is a volunteer, who is an activist, and what are the political connotations that those terms have. During my fieldwork, I saw a lot of people referring to them just like a citizen. I'm just part of your community and I'm just here working because I want a better life for me and my community. So I'm not maybe an activist because then I put myself in a very dangerous position. So we have to think about that. And it's one of the things that I really wanted to highlight there. And also one of the things, another thing that we have to learn a lot is how do we build these communities of action and practice? Like, for example, within my work, Mexico, I have been working with them and I was an initiator of this movement. I have realized that we exclude a lot of people because of the requirements, for example, that we ask for, like how many hours do you have to be involved? Which languages do you have to talk? Like, for example, Mexico is such a diverse country and we ask for Spanish, but we leave behind so many indigenous communities that can bring amazing insights. And we don't think about it. We really don't reflect on that until we face these hegemonic practices that we are carrying along, not because we want, but because it happened somehow, because we weren't critical enough. And well, I think that Chris also asked me to reflect about how can we ensure that this social change is a little bit more inclusive from the movements, and what do we need as activists and volunteers to reflect on to do this a little bit more equitable and just. And I think that one of the main things, well, I have been working with a movement that it's called Flor del Desierto, and we are working with women from a rural community in Zapotitlan Salinas. And while you were talking about financing and financial institutions, I was having in my mind all these experiences where we have to be fighting for financial resources for this project. For example, I'm going to put you the link here. And we are doing activities that the community doesn't even want or need, but just because the financial institutions are asking us for those activities. So we have to be very critical about what the community really wants and needs and how we are using these resources that we are in the position or power position to have and to give as well, and what are the movements that we are supporting. For example, within My War Mexico, I really like My War Mexico, but I have learned, like, I know that we have too many bad practices, but now I'm aware about that, and that I don't want to replicate, like, for example, with this movement of Flor del Desierto. But for example, with My War Mexico, we have a lot of financial support because we were very related with the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. But actually we weren't having that meaningful impact as I feel that we are having now with Flor del Desierto, and we have to be playing with these concepts and terms and identities as well, and activities to implement in the community. What do we need as well? I feel that something that we are really missing is critical education. To make people understand. There is a phrase that I really like during my field work, that it was something like, understand who I am and understand myself for who I am and what, I'm sorry, I'm translating from Spanish, so maybe it's not a pretty good translation, but understand myself for who I am and what I know. And not just that I am Abigail from Mexico, but that I am Abigail from Mexico, a brown woman who has lived in a city that it's industrialized and that we don't have access for water because of what? Because of the colonization, maybe, because of the capitalist system, because all these operations and everything. So we have to really give education that is critical and that makes us understand our context, because we don't understand our own context sometimes, because we have been educated maybe with a colonial view. For example, I'm from the north of Mexico, so we have this very Americanized system of education that doesn't really make us think about what is the situation in our city and why we don't have access to water or to clean air. Why do we breathe all these substances, and what are we being dead by asthma or something like that, or why the asthma indices are that high? So we have to think about that. It has to be like a critical education that makes you think who we are, where we are, and what we know as well, to be critical about our learning and to relearn all what we have been taught so far. And also, well, I put here, sorry, I have a mess with my notes because I was thinking and I was just writing around. But also one of the things that I have to put here is that also we have to include education about how institutions work. And because sometimes we don't know how the institutions work. Like, for example, institutions from the United Nations, sometimes we want to go and a personal experience, like I have had the experience to go to UNESCO, but I don't know how UNESCO works. And I go there and I try to make my statement and I try to participate, but I don't know, I don't have a strong knowledge about how it works and how my participation should be directed or something to be meaningful. So that's something that I feel that volunteers, call them volunteers, activists, or young people that want to be involved in social change processes need. Like how these institutions work, how our system work, how our capitalist system work, and how can we engage in a way, in a critical way to change it. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks. It's really, really good and really good examples as well. And I think you've highlighted the importance of understanding that youth volunteering and any other social change exists in a world where there's a lot of inequalities and colonial legacies, etc. And we need to sort of be very aware of that when we think about social change. In fact, one of the questions here from Simone is around the SDGs. And I think you've talked about that. And I know Yvette has talked about policy making, and also Mohsen, I know you're involved in this, and David. So I wanted to get people's, just maybe any response to the question here by Simone. So the recent political declaration is issued by the SDG Summit in 2023 has been heralded as transformative. yet it does not refer a word on volunteerism or civic engagement. It's interesting. So what happened to the UNV's global agenda from the GTM in 2020? And how can we really bring volunteerism at the center of policymaking, for example, as a tool to localize the SDGs? And how can we make volunteering cool for policymakers? Because according to Simone, it seems like nobody cares. So any really critical question. Thanks, Simone, for highlighting that. Anybody would like to have a go with that question? Mohsen,
Happy to jump in since I've been engaged on both ends. So my pardon my language, but we need to make volunteering more sexy for it to sell in the world. Second bit is everyone in the world wants to use a different word to volunteering just to show there's something new. The problem is we've been talking about these things for years, and we will be talking about the same issue 10 years down the lane. We need to innovate. What is really needed is we need policy innovation and experimentation in the space, and we need to align the traditional discourse around volunteering with the upcoming policy debates, discourses, and all that innovation language that is very much needed. And we need to bring back the cool in engagement. One is that, and second is we need to celebrate volunteerism on the same level as we celebrate youth entrepreneurs, maybe. Right? And we just show this is an extremely important part of building a future of work, from future work agenda lens or just transition lens. And so you need to align it to the poly crisis that are happening around the world. And you need to show volunteering as an umbrella concept that is cross-cutting across, different domains and works, rather than just a one department's job within UN or somewhere else. Yeah, and her name is Abigail. She's
yeah,
not sure. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mohsen. Yeah, very, very good points. Yvette, I wondered if you have any. I know you're also been involved around SDGs, and I wondered what your reflections is on the question.
I mean, I think I agree with what Mohsen said, but the whole idea or the topic around policy is quite interesting, but you wonder if there's going to be any change, right? Because in the end, the question is, where does it start from and where does it end? Who brings about the policies? But I think that in this case, globally, there's a lot that can be done, but how is it going to be effected on the ground, with grassroots organizations, like I said, because they are the ones that these policies will affect the most. So if we sit on global or regional, boards or organizations and talk about policies that really would impact people on the national level or the grassroots, and then we're not really including them, then there's not going to be any change. So I think the change needs to start from, communities that definitely have impact, but together with community leaders, people that can talk to regional bodies, and then eventually national and country level, because this is the only way that policies can be gotten to work. And again, policies for one specific topic may differ from one country to the other. What affects somebody in the UK does not necessarily affect me in Ghana or in Nigeria or in Venezuela, as an example. So again, we probably need to look into what kind of policies will be general for all, but what are the ones that can also be impacted in our own small way in our various countries and individual levels. So I think that's a pretty complicated topic, but definitely something that needs to be tackled eventually. How? I'm not too sure.
Yeah, the question I think is really, how does volunteerism or volunteering, considering how complex it is, features in this global agenda, the SDGs that a lot of people are talking about? David, I look to you. I know you're part of UNICEF, and
I would say a couple things, and I very much like what Yvette is saying. I actually think change happens locally. So you can get these big global pronouncements and big global meetings, and I'm not sure the extent to which they cascade down into change. And there was an American politician who died many years ago who used to say all politics is local. I think there's real truth to that, because I don't want to suggest all volunteering is political, but if we're talking about policy change, then it better be political. Otherwise, it's not going to be impactful. On the topic of the SDGs, well, first of all, I don't know, the SDG summit, you said that occurred last month and it was declared as transformative. That seems to be kind of self-referential and self-congratulatory. It remains to be seen if it's transformational. Well, right now we're wildly off track. It seems to me uncontroversial to say that working with people, including volunteers, whatever you want to call them, the term volunteer doesn't resonate universally. So in some places it's a term that works, in others it's not. That's okay. We're not defending the label or the term. We're defending the sort of the practice of people organizing on their own in various ways and helping to move the dial on different issues. So I think I do think that we should, at the global level, yes, we should elevate the importance of volunteering or civic engagement, and point out that in terms of social change and how it happens, it's hard to imagine social change of the scale envisioned by the SDGs happening without deep and broad civic engagement or volunteering. So that should be pointed out. That in itself won't be the game changer, I think, but that doesn't get us off the hook. Let's kind of, make sure it's embedded in UN processes and documents. And I certainly will do my part. And then hopefully, that can help support efforts more locally, which again, as Yvette was saying, is where I think the change happens and where volunteering is actually felt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think I'm wondering whether Matthew, Abigail, and Nadia perhaps could talk a little bit more about the localization of SDGs and whether, to what extent are these global sort of agendas really useful at the ground, and particularly for youth volunteers. I wondered what your opinion on that is. Matthew, did you want to have a start?
Yeah, again, it's how do you disseminate, as David's rightly said, we have these big global conversations. It's about disseminating that down to local level. It gets, I suppose, to a level at a point where the information gets to, and it's whether the people that are getting that information then start to trickle it down so that you're almost feeding, the grassroots of volunteering is young people, and it's volunteers and people who are actually participating in that. And if that information isn't getting to them, then how are they going to start to make these effective changes that's going to see the growth of volunteering and really starting to flourish? And I think it's a really difficult, topic and conversation around trying to unpick that, and for the growth to occur off the back of these, massive conversations that are happening. It's about giving young people the opportunity to sort of have those conversations and start to develop practices and sort of shape how that's going to happen going forward. And I suppose in terms of an NI context, that's really what we're working towards now, is getting young people in the sort of say, right, youth volunteering, what is it, how we're going to engage young people. That's really the big question at the minute, because the spaces that have been occupied by people prior and before, they're not there anymore, and I think it goes back to one of the previous points, that you reflected upon, Chris, about that parachuting into those spaces. If we're parachuting into them, but we're sort of getting that information but not acting upon it, and then at what level are we actually working towards improving the sector for young people to get involved in youth volunteering and ultimately, better their communities and societies and the world as a whole?
Yeah, really good point about especially the parachuting and the tendency of some of these global agendas to sometimes co-opt young people's work, which I think is the most it happens, and it's really challenging. Abigail, I don't know what you think about the term sustainable development and how applicable it is to the spaces where you work. Maybe they don't use the term, they don't like the term sustainable development.
Well, actually, we do use it a lot in my work, Mexico, because I feel that it has become a strategy to participate in these global conversations as well, because we cannot ignore them. They are still there. They are institutionalized, and we have to be very critical about it, of course, because maybe we don't want to not think about it and all the implications, the political implications that it has. But it has been also a tool to get involved, especially with financing. I find in Mexico, people and grassroots movements into the global conversation. Like, for example, in my work, Mexico, one of the things that we found pretty useful, it was to involve young people and people working in local communities in what are the SDGs, because well, they have been working on those social change processes during their whole life, but it wasn't like institutionalized in an SDG. So we kind of told them, like, maybe what you are doing is life in ocean. So maybe now you can link it with the SDG, I don't know, you name it. And then you can ask for financing, and then you can participate in this global conversation. So I think that at the end, it become like common language, which you have to be very critical about again, because you also have to defend the specificities of your community as well, and not to let the SDGs to be the general kind of panorama where you are going to be working on.
Yeah, I think the question of how you localize the SDGs and how do you build in volunteering to do that, I think it's an interesting question. And Nadia, I wondered what your thoughts are. And I'm aware that Nadia's work has a lot of support from her company, from like the corporate that she's working in. So it's another form of partnership, corporate volunteering and all these things. And I wondered whether you'd had reflections on the topic. Yeah.
So a lot of these conversations, as mentioned by so many before, it's like, have up here, we need to trickle down. So someone like me, coming from this sort of discussion, I'll take it back and I'll make sure that everyone within our company sort of gets the extent of what was discussed here and what we're hoping to achieve. But then corporate is just sort of one cohort. So how are we going to get to everybody else? And then we also, social media is so big. And just to touch on that point of how we're going to make volunteering cool again is what I try and do is I try and find a sort of influencer that is willing to take on a volunteering aspect and make it sort of big. They pull in the numbers with the youth that have a name out there already. So, so they're spreading what it is that we're trying to achieve. But again, that's only another cohort. And then we look at the youth that maybe in the underprivileged areas, how are we going to reach them? So I suppose that is a lot of what we're trying to achieve, is like, there's so much that needs to be done. We need all hands on deck. How are we going to get this out there, right, to absolutely everybody or every cohort within these areas? And so what the platform that I've been given within our corporation is to just build partnerships outside of corporate. So we like to challenge other corporates, and that's how we get more than just discovery sort of involved, because then we can sort of replicate what we're doing, and then we sort of get a wider reach. And then beyond corporates, we also try and do this in our personal lives. Over the weekends when we're busy with the youth in youth holiday programs like we've got going now. We've got something on Friday, and when these youth, when we're done with them, we always make sure that they know exactly what it is that we're trying to achieve. We need their involvement, as well as the community leaders as well, because we can't get anything done if we don't have the buy-in from the community leaders as well, right? So that's sort of like what we sort of try and do on our end, and just like my thoughts on how we can get a wider reach and get the word sort of out there on what was discussed on like a higher level.
Thanks so much, Nadia. That's very practical suggestions as well. If you can believe it, we're already at the last 10 minutes of the session. So that went really fast. And I'd like to take this opportunity to request our panelists of any final thoughts. It could be around youth volunteering and social change. It could be any other issues or points that you'd like to emphasize. I'd like to go around the Zoom room to give you an opportunity to give your final message or closing message to the audience. And let's change it up a little bit, and we'll start with Abby. Abby, are you happy to do that? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's all right. So I think that one of my main taken or main emphasis that I want to do here in this space is that volunteering is very important, but also we have to be very critical about this institutionalization of the volunteerism and what are we excluding from this discourse of being a volunteer or not being a volunteer, and who are we leaving behind, and how can we, I mean, I wish I could have an answer, but I don't think that there are specific answers. And how can we make volunteer or activism or civil engagement more inclusive? I think that there are a lot of things to do, and not because I'm an educator, well, yeah, because I'm an educator, but I'm also a practitioner, and I feel that critical education is one of those ways. Like, we need to recognize our struggles. We need to recognize all the intersections that have us in the positionality that we are coming from, and work towards it from the community. It is important that we are involved, of course, in these global conversations, but we also have to work from the communities and from the needs of the communities and recognize this pluriverse of volunteerism as well.
All right, great. Thank you, Abby. Matthew.
Yeah, I think you know, we talk about youth volunteering and social change, and we've talked a lot around the sort of different issues and topics that have come up throughout the series, you know, and putting our final reflections on to throughout the course of the webinar. You know, and I know, Jaren, when speaking about inclusion, you know, I had mentioned about removing barriers or reducing them, you know, to include young people in volunteering and voluntary opportunities. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge to organizations across the world to continue to do that, so that young people can get involved in volunteering and social change. And as well as that, moving towards not so much the volunteering, but the causes that young people are passionate around and how they can address that. You know, looking at, even in the UK, the I Will movement, and with I Will Week coming up, you know, the big sort of focus for it is, what if the next 10 years youth social action and youth social change isn't just one big issue, but instead is lots of little things coming together to affect real change, you know. And I suppose putting the emphasis on that all the individual issues and problems that young people are working towards and volunteering and being activists towards, you know, improving for society as a whole, bringing them all together as small things to make one big change, you know, can be just as effective.
Thanks, Matthew. Nadia.
I'm going to touch on the quote that Mary, that you highlighted from Mary from South Africa in the beginning, and that was to include or involve youth not only at implementation stage, but earlier. And I am sort of 100% with that. So if you ask me, we need to, the areas where there is a need is where we need the youth to sort of get involved, right? And so, because who to better understand what the needs are, what the issues are. And it's like I said, community leaders as well as the youth. You'll find that the youth are the ones who really want to do something, because they want like a brighter future. They want more opportunities, and they want to be prepared for those opportunities. And so what I touched a little bit on the program that we are trying to run here, where we start with sort of equipping these young individuals and getting them to a state of being confident, and we want them to become champions. So this is our first year of the program. So when we get to the end of this year, we are not going to be done with them. They have to become our champions next year and help us drive these programs with the next group, right? So that the following group of youth sort of see their peers that they know within their communities being these sort of leaders as well and becoming champions, and they're going to look up to them and they're going to want to be the same. And there's also, it's not just creating opportunities like I said before, but it's also preparing them, and with them sort of running these programs with us, they're getting exposure. And then again, with the partnering of these different kind of organizations that are already running with such amazing initiatives, we can't only, like, because we work in a corporate, so we can't only expose them to corporate, because all of these kids are not going to want to be in corporate. So we've got to leverage of these other initiatives that are running, right? We've got to get them into like sports or art, and all of those type of things. So we really are trying to empower them as best we can, starting with you, the individual, because the need is so great. And if you take it down and you break it down to an individual, then you can sort of see that this is a very solvable sort of problem. And then obviously you replicate that and you are solving for the needs of many. And then if you have these the youth with you, I think and like I said, you have the youth and you're leveraging off these other partnerships, because in silos we are going to our reach is going to be like minimal. But we touch on, if we like all come together and we're sort of leveraging off one another, the impact is going to be great.
Yeah.
So
collaboration.
Yeah.
Definitely. Movement building is basically sort of what
Yes,
needs to be done.
100%.
And I think that's a point you talked about, David. So gonna go on.
Very quickly, I know we're coming up on time. To deliver social change you got to be able to scale interventions. Staffed organizations can't do it, volunteers can. You got to be able to reach deep into communities so that you can access, especially the neediest. Volunteers, they're in the communities. So when it comes to scale, reach, and access, we can't do it. We can't deliver social change where it needs to happen most without working with volunteers.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And then we have Yvette.
I mean, I think everybody has said it all, but I think one thing that came to mind whilst David was speaking about scale was more of like, how do we also communicate this by the media, right? Because that's one way we can really promote what is really happening on the ground. I don't remember, I think somebody also spoke about celebrating volunteering as much as we celebrate other initiatives like youth entrepreneurship, this innovative things that that is happening in other spheres. But if we are also able to sort of like celebrate that and toot our horns to say that this is what is happening, no matter how small it is, I think that would get the recognition it needs, but also can be a driver for amplifying the social changes that we want to see, because we are already working on them as young people. So yeah, that's just what's at.
Yeah, thanks, Yvette. And Mohsen, would you like to close us up?
Yeah, sure. A lot has been said. Just adding on to towards the end that we need to make an investment case for volunteerism. We need to make a policy case, and to do so, we need data. We need a lot of mapping. What I've seen over the years is there's a dearth of disaggregated data around young people and volunteers. It's a big area that requires a lot of support, and that will hopefully help build investment case, showcases, media engagement, and a branding portfolio that is needed to institutionalize youth volunteerism in the right way around the world. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mohsen. And thank you very much to all our panelists for their really insightful contributions. And while I think, Gal, you're supposed to share the slide of the future webinars, I'd just like to really thank all of our panelists for their time today. That has been really insightful. IAVE has 2 more upcoming webinars on common good. You have the details here on October and in November. And again, yeah, Mohsen for Preston. So thank you again, everybody, for coming, and thank you for IAVE for convening this. Of course, to Gal, who's helping us online, and of course to Wendy for bringing us all together. Really, I hope you all have a good afternoon, evening, or rest of your day wherever you're joining us from. Again, thank you so much, and see you all.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.